Module 2, Aruba Instant Wireless LAN Configuration. In this module, we will look at the Wireless LAN Wizard, the Wireless LAN settings, the possible VLAN selections you can do for each wireless LAN, the authentication that you want, instant SSID, and how to set up zones. The wizard is an easy way to configure the SSIDs you need for your IP cluster. You will go through 4 stages when utilizing the wizard. The first stage is to select the type of SSID you want to configure. Employee and voice selections will lead you to 802.1x and PSK authentication. The guest option will lead you to the captive portal authentication. The next stage is to select what VLAN and therefore what IP address the users will get. The security stage depends on your wireless LAN setting selections. Enterprise will give you 802.1x selections. Personal will give you PSK or WEP selections. If you select guest, then you will receive captive portal options. The last stage is the settings for the firewall with the user rights. A new IP cluster that has not been directed to a management system such as Airwave or Central will advertise the instant SSID. Once logged on to the instant SSID, you can configure other wireless LANs. Simply click the New under Networks. Here, for the wireless LAN setting, you are presented with the name of the SSID you wish to create as well as 3 choices for the type of SSID. The employee option would lead to other windows for PSK or 802.1x authentication. The voice network will allow you to configure the SSID for only voice services such as handsets or applications that require voice traffic prioritization. The guest option allows you to configure the captive portal. On the bottom of the page, you can expand this window to see the advanced settings. In the network section, we selected New and launched the Wireless LAN Wizard. You were initially presented with a simple window where you enter the name of the SSID. You are presented with 3 simple choices: employee, voice, and guests. One must be selected. If you click the advanced settings, you are presented with many more options: broadcast multicast options, transmit rate selections, bandwidth limitations that will be imposed on this SSID. WMM parameters can be used when dealing with voice traffic. Miscellaneous parameters such as content filtering and band. Zones can be selected to limit a wireless LAN to a specific IP in a cluster. The second Wireless LAN Wizard window is the VLAN selection. There are 5 starting points to set up an SSID with a VLAN setting. The network assigned option is typically used for corporate users, and there are 3 choices: default, static, and dynamic. For the virtual controller managed option, the default setting is typically used to assign an IP address to the guest. The custom option will allow various choices as to how and what DHCP server will be used. If you select virtual controller assigned and the default option, then the client will receive an IP address from the IP. In this example, the IP gets a 10.1.10.56 address from the DHCP server. The IP is in VLAN 10 on the switch. The user associates to the IP and gets an IP address from the 172.31.98 subnet originating from the IP. If this subnet is in conflict with the network, then the 10.254.98 subnet will be used. This subnet can be configured if desired. All of the user traffic is then NATed to the IP's IP address. The virtual controller assigned option is typically used for guest access. If you select virtual controller assigned and then the custom option, then the client will receive an IP address from the IP DHCP server. In this example, the user will get an IP address from the DHCP server on the IP. There are 3 choices: local scope, distributed DHCP scope, and centralized scope. The last two choices are used when the IPs have a VPN connection back to corporate and will be further explained in the VPN section of this course. The local DHCP server can be set up if you wish the IP to assign IP addresses to the users. If you select Network Assigned and Default, the client will receive an IP address from the corporate network. In this example, the IP gets a 10.1.10.59 address from the corporate DHCP server. The user associates to the IP and gets a 10.1.10.57 address, which is the same subnet as the IP. If you select Network Assigned and Static, you can statically set which VLAN the users will fall into based on the SSID. The IP is in its own subnet. The administrator configures the SSID with a specific VLAN. In this example, the IP is in VLAN 10. The user associating to the teacher SSID have been configured to fall into VLAN 5. And the users associating to the student SSID have been configured to fall into a VLAN pool of 16, 17, or 18. In this case, the clients are randomly assigned a VLAN from the configured pool. For this to work, you must configure the IP switch with a trunk protocol 802.1q and set up the same VLANs. If you select Network Assigned and Dynamic, the VLAN is derived. The IP is in its own subnet. The administrator will set up the VLAN derivation rule on the IP. In this example, a user associates to the school SSID will fall in a VLAN based on the rules configured on the IP and what is returned from the server after authentication. A default VLAN may be set if no value is returned from the server. For this to work, you must also configure the IP switch with a trunk protocol and set up the same VLANs as the ones that will be derived. After you select the dynamic option, you can assign the VLAN by creating VLAN assignment rules. First, click New to create a VLAN rule. In the new VLAN assignment rule window, you can choose the options that have been coordinated between the IP and the Radius server. If using the ClearPass with Aruba VSAs, then there is no need to create any rules. IPs will immediately understand Aruba VSAs. You can leave the SSID totally open, or you can add MAC authentication. If you choose MAC authentication, then more options will be displayed. You also have the option of implementing the standards for fast roaming. The 802.11k protocol provides mechanisms for APs and clients to dynamically measure the available radio resources. APs and clients can share radio and link measurement information. The 802.11v standards provides wireless network management enhancements. The IPs support the generations of the BSS Transition Management Request Frames 802.11k. When a suitable AP is identified for the client through client match, an 802.11k message can be sent, if supported. If you choose the personal security level, then you can select the key management system and enter the proper key. MAC authentication can be added for extra security if needed. For personal security level, you can use the WPA2 personal passphrase for encryption. You can also select WPA personal or static WEP as needed. When using MAC authentication, please make sure the format of the MAC address matches the delimiter characters settings. For example, since it is blank by default, the MAC address in the authentication database should be no delimiters. Example, 340286-1F A04A. No delimiters. You can use an external server, but you can also use the internal server for MAC authentication. With the enterprise security level, you have the full suite of 802.1x authentication with WPA, WPA2, or both. Dynamic WEP with 802.1x is also a choice, but not recommended. The re-authentication interval can be set to force devices to re-authenticate at various intervals. On top of 802.1x, you can perform MAC authentication before or after 802.1x. Authentication survivability allows the IPs to authenticate the previously connected client against the cached credentials if the connection to the authentication server is temporarily lost. The last window in the wireless LAN wizard is the access window, the firewall. This is where you will determine the access level for the users. You have three choices: unrestricted, therefore no restrictions and a totally open SSID. This is the same as an any permit rule. Network-based. This would include rules for all the devices associated to this SSID. Role-based. These are configured roles with rules that can be assigned by devices on this SSID. This would typically require the use of an external server. The firewall will be explained in more detail in another module. Once the first wireless LAN is created, the open instant wireless LAN is automatically deleted by the system. An IP or IPs can be placed in a zone. Please note that an IP can only belong to one zone. All SSIDs that are not part of a zone will be advertised by all IPs in the cluster. Any SSID configured as belonging to a zone will only be advertised by the IPs belonging to that zone. If the SSID is configured in a zone but no IPs are part of that zone, then the SSID is not broadcasted. You can decide which IPs you wish to add to a specific zone. You can select the edit option next to each IP and place them in a zone. Then simply give the zone a name. All the wireless LAN placed in the same zone will only be advertised on the IPs within that zone. To place a wireless LAN in a zone, you edit the wireless LAN. In the advanced section of the wireless LAN settings, you can write the name of the zone. This SSID will only be advertised on IPs identified in the same zone. In this module, we saw the wireless LAN wizard, the wireless LAN settings, the wireless LAN VLAN selections, such as virtual controller, the wireless LAN authentication, guest, 802.1x. We saw what happens to the instant SSID once a wireless LAN is created. And we also saw that zones can be created where IPs placed in zones will only advertise the SSID that are in the same zone.